Good day to one and all, and welcome to Encyclopedia Hermetica, Part 41. I know I said I'd be starting the Punic Wars, but I realize I should probably do a little bit of housekeeping on Roman society before we get into that whole mess. I wanted to tie up some loose ends, focusing chiefly on the authority structures at Rome and one's education through it. In general, I'll also be talking about education in the Greek and Roman world, chiefly the Roman world, since they borrowed so much from Greece, but there isn't much we can say without discussing the two as a pair. Education in ancient Rome evolved very slowly. It evolved gradually. It was an uneven process, and so I don't want to give anyone the impression that there was some sort of monolithic system set in place, a kind of intellectual gauntlet everyone had to run, which led to the society we like to imagine as the crystallizers of Western civilization. The system progressed from a very informal, familial system of home education, and this was in the early Republican period, so to refresh your memory, this was from about the 6th century to the 2nd century BC. Gradually, this whole task of educating the young became too onerous for individual family members or tutors, and tuition-based systems would be introduced during the late Republic and the Empire. St. Augustine gives us plenty of information on this system in his Confessions, but that was centuries from where we are today, of course. Now, most of the friction of the Greek method happened in the 2nd century BC, and by the 1st century BC, most wealthy families had their children instructed in the Greek style, whether in Rome, elsewhere in Italy, or abroad alongside some intellectual heavyweight of the day. So, since our earliest Greek literature is poetry, we need to look at Homer, Hesiod, Pindar, Sappho, and a number of lesser-known figures to get an idea of what Greek education was actually like from an early period. Throughout the Dark Ages, most education was in the form of apprenticeships. These were in practical skills, farming, sailing, that sort of thing. And this was because literacy had entirely vanished among the Greeks until the Phoenician script was adapted to write down the Homeric epics. Well, at least as far as our evidence can get us. We've got nothing else written in Phoenicio-Greek script before the poetry of quote-unquote Homer, and ultimately we just don't know if something else was written down in this script before Homer, such as inventory lists, annals, or inscriptions. But by and large, we take tradition at face value on this issue, even though we generally needn't. Anyhow, Pindar, one of Greece's oldest and most venerable poets, actually criticized the education giving of his own time, claiming that it was better just to know things by nature, that is, by inheriting wisdom, aka being born into an aristocratic family, rather than to go out and learn things. Shamanic or religious initiations, traditional wisdom, mythological topoi, all these served as pre-literate educational tools as well. Otherwise, from about the 6th century onwards, for a general sense of how Greek or Roman education worked, we have plenty of sources. Dramas, speeches, philosophical literature, biographies, technical treatises, legal texts, scripture, inscriptions, and so on and so forth. I think we've gone in some detail before on the phenomenon of how Athenian democracy spawned the sophists, the itinerant preachers of rhetoric at Athens, who preached a philosophy of relativism. I won't get into too much detail about them. I've also talked about the school of Pythagoras at Crotona, the Lycurgan Agoge of Sparta, which was obviously vastly different as a system of education. I talked about the Academy of Plato and even the Library of Alexandria. So it suffices to say that I've had an eye toward education since the beginning of the lecture series. So I don't want to dwell on Greek education too long. I think most of you probably get it. It was gym, music and poetry, grammar, logic, and dialectic. And by and large, that system worked wonders on children. So let's move on to the Romans. Now, like I just said, the Roman education system gradually evolved to incorporate the fundamentals of the Greek system, the system that spread across the entire Mediterranean during the Hellenistic period and was used by most royals and aristocrats. It's always important to keep in mind that this phenomenon arose entirely on account of a Roman ambivalence toward the Greeks. On the one hand, the Romans greatly admired Greek culture, but on the other, they were constantly embroiled in war with them. Over the centuries between the 3rd and 1st centuries, they conquered and enslaved many Greek city-states, and this subsequently led to a great influx of private tutors at Rome, who were either Greek slaves or freedmen. This whole phenomenon was encapsulated in Book 2, lines 156 and 157 of Horace's Epistles, wherein he wrote, Graecia capta ferrum victorem cepit, et artes intulit agresti Latio. Captured Greece took captive her savage conqueror, and waged art upon rustic Latium. And this is how it was done, by taking their intellectuals and giving them the job of pedagogoi, raising Roman kids. It was a status symbol to have a Greek slave. None of these filthy Thracians could teach you how to read Homer, so they were only good as prostitutes and miners and latrine cleaners. It was sort of the equivalent of a wealthy American having a British butler today. Anyone can get a Mexican nanny wage slave for $5 an hour, but not everybody can fit the 6-figure salary of a highly educated tutor and home manager into their budget. This became a facet of conspicuous consumption, buying into this educational fad that could help you fit into high society. Now, all this being said, there were obviously a great number of free Greek scholars who made a good amount of coin throughout the Hellenistic world. I should add, though, that it wouldn't be until about 272 BC, with the capture of Tarentum and the annexation of Sicily in 241 BC, that Rome was thoroughly exposed to Greek thought. In fact, up to that point, they didn't even really have the wealth or leisure to study the arts and humanities anyways. This leisure was delivered on platters held by slaves, Greeks and non-Greeks alike. Anyhow, this trend of giving your children a Greek education would radically change the face of Roman civilization forever. It would only serve to increase the ambivalence of the Romans against the Greeks. Their thoughts were just so lofty, while their sense of Roman values was just so lacking. This trend would spawn a whole generation of curmudgeonly anti-Greek sentiment along the Roman upper classes, but by and large, these people were thought of as just that, old curmudgeons going on about the glory days of Romanitas, when their ancestors weren't all wrapped up in decadent Eastern effeminacy. Marcus Porcius Cato, 234 to 149 BC, was the real poster boy for this conservative ideology, and this was no mere xenophobia either. Cato knew his Greek letters, and he had his own reasons. In the old way of doing things, in the early centuries of Roman history, Roman education was chiefly focused on family values, loyalty, truthfulness, piety, etc., and on acquiring influence. Greek music, rhetoric and philosophy weren't exactly valued. The Romans had their own way of doing things. Why would I want to learn to talk like a fag and stick my head in the clouds? That sort of mentality. They'd largely get over this kind of disdain for Greek things as the centuries went on, with kids going off to Athens like we go off to college, but we can deduce quite a lot from how the Romans conceived their own identity by looking at what people like Cato expressly stated they disliked, though of course we shouldn't always take them at their word. It's worth noting that even the most Hellenized of Romans, such as Cicero, would still put on Catonian airs to rile up his crowd against the Eastern excesses of an opponent, whenever the moment called for it. So, the anti-Greek sentiment of Cato became a common topos in Roman oratory, well after the Catonic school had lost. Now, as the centuries rolled on, and as a result of Rome's expansive borders and its collision with the Hellenistic world, Greco-Roman educational methodologies were copied throughout the empire's provinces. In many cases, they were already there before the Romans even arrived. And this really went a long way in establishing the foundation for education systems throughout medieval Christendom. Now, we've gone over this together. If you want to go back to the lecture on the Tribune, you can learn about that system in more detail and how to apply its principles to your own life as well. Nevertheless, if we want to look at the big picture, systems of organized education were relatively rare. There are very few primary sources concerning specifically Roman education until the 2nd century A.D. Ultimately, the degree and quality of education provided to the Roman children varied drastically from family to family, which at the time was conceived as the smallest possible unit of society, headed by a pater familias. Gradually, it became expected for fathers to have their sons educated, and a real thorough education was expected for any Roman who wished to enter politics. This thread leads us to talk about the Cursus Honorum, the path of honors, or the course of offices, which, although is a dry subject to discuss, it will become increasingly important as we move through Roman history. Before going into this section, I want to say that talking about this system in a monolithic way over the course of centuries is pretty problematic. It's hard to speak about the purpose of the Cursus Honorum in origin and then its function in the late Republic, since as Rome grew, offices took on new functions and various customs were adopted as quick fixes for various social crises. Rome's 2nd and 1st century political system was a collection of historical heirlooms and recent innovations to meet the demands of empire. Obviously, the system in place in the 1st century BC would differ vastly from that of the 4th century BC. So let's just keep this in mind as we sketch through this. So, education did not end in childhood. If you were part of the right families during the Republican period, your whole life was basically laid out for you in accordance with an educational framework. Now, remember how I mentioned that Roman education was chiefly centered on family values and acquiring influence? Well, this is why. It's called the Cursus Honorum. This Cursus Honorum was the sequential order of public offices specifically set aside for aspiring politicians in Rome. This was not for your average plebeian individual who was generally illiterate and was educated in his father's trade. We shouldn't think of this educational system in terms of schools with grades where we'd learn grammar, logic, and rhetoric. This system went above and beyond that. This was a civic responsibility that had deep spiritual implications. So Learning your letters was expected to have been mastered by the time a boy was old enough to take up the toga of manhood, and that was at 14. Rather, the Cursus Honorum functioned as a system for giving quote-unquote life experience to men of senatorial rank. But this was not so much the product of design as it was the product of centuries' worth of evolution in the form of small ad hoc reforms. It comprised a delicate balance of military and political/administrative posts. Each post or office had a minimum age for election, so anyone who was too young and inexperienced was barred from the Senate, which, to be fair, means gathering of old men. You had minimum intervals of time between holding successive offices, and there were laws put in place at various times prohibiting individuals from holding the same office twice. It's worth noting that, given the turbulent history of Rome, no rule was without its own exceptions, be it the consulship of the generals Scipio Africanus at age 25 or Pompey the Great at age 26. These exceptions were rare, though. It was considered merit enough for one to earn a consulship in suo anno, that is, in the first year of one's eligibility, as Cicero enjoyed boasting about. Now, obviously, as the Roman Republic started to degenerate, these rules were altered, bypassed, and conveniently ignored whenever it was most expedient. And this, you might say, would become a huge factor in the decline of the republican system in favor of empire. So, Gaius Marius, for example, one of the key figures in the Roman Revolution, had held a consulship, the highest position in the Republic, for 5 years in a row between 104 BC and 100 BC. On the surface, these offices served as opportunities for public service, to test one's administrative mettle. The reality, however, was that such offices were more often used to get a leg up in the game of Roman power politics. Now, Brett Bartlett, who I'll be having on next for our Punic War chat, gave me a hand by editing this lecture, and here's a note he added. The curious thing of Rome is how dichotomous they were. The Romans strove to uphold the mos maiorum, it is the customs of the ancestors, or literally the ways of the elders, but they also innovated whenever time demanded it. There's a funny passage in Pro Lege Manilia where Cicero defends himself against the accusations that he's breaking from the mos maiorum. The new man defends himself with this hilarious and sophisticated rebuttal that nostri maiores, our ancestors, always innovated in times of crisis, and thus to fail to do so would be to reject the mos maiorum. Now, Brett would disagree that the Romans' less than rigid approach to law was what ended the Republic, claiming that it only lasted as long as it did on account of this very flexibility. So there's definitely a competing perspective on whether Rome's strength was a product of its rigidity or its laxity. This actually reminds me of two quotes I love to juxtapose, one by Marcus Aurelius and the other by Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee said, "Notice that the stiffest tree is most easily cracked, while the bamboo or the willow survives by bending with the wind." This rings true, right? Well, here's Marcus Aurelius. "Man must be arched and buttressed from within, else the temple wavers to the dust." So this also rings true, right? Well, ultimately, it's the delicate balance between flexibility and rigidity where true strength is found, not the polar extremes. Anyhow, I don't mean to extrapolate this too far into metaphysical speculation, so let's move on. Okay, so briefly, what did this Cursus Honorum comprise of? What were these offices? Now, I should mention right away that this isn't an entirely linear path. There's a variety of offices one might branch off the main course for, depending on your class, but by and large, there was the military tribune first. 10 years later, one became a quaestor. Then there were a couple of offices you could take, but by and large, the aim was to become a praetor, which was a kind of judge, which was the last step before you became one of the 2 consuls for the year. I'll come back to these in detail. Now, to have held each office at the youngest age possible, in suo anno, in his year, as the Romans said, this was the great indicator for political success. If you missed out on praetorship at 39, it meant that you couldn't become consul at 42. So the great rhetorician Cicero was very proud not only to have been a novus homo, a new man or a self-made man who was made consul despite the fact that none of his ancestors had ever served as consuls. He was also quite proud of having become consul in his year. What you can see is that this is a lifelong project, and to call it merely an education is a bit misleading, I must admit. Now, I should mention, don't get me wrong here, the system of political inauguration or education was thoroughly Roman. There was really nothing Greek about it. Greek education laid the foundation for many young Romans, but when it came to the political machinery of Rome, there wasn't much Greek wisdom could offer. Their system was clearly inferior at creating political and military leaders, and the fact that so many Greek poleis fell under Roman control was living proof, at least to the Romans, of their system's superiority. That being said, obviously, we shouldn't really conceive of history in this way. These civilizations didn't live as immortal archetypes in vacuums. Their successes and their failures were contingent on the people, places, and things which surrounded them. What you'll find, though, is that the traditional Roman caste system played an integral role in shaping society and in defining power. So let's get into some of the nitty-gritty, because this will all matter from here on out. Alright, so you're a young boy, you've been under the patria potestas your whole life, your father has the power of life and death over you, he's made sure you've gotten all the ECE you need for success. Now, Quintilian, a famous rhetorician, recognized the importance of starting education as early as possible. We could call him the grandfather of neuroplasticity. Maybe that's attributing to him a little much, but in any case, he said this: memory not only exists even in small children, but is especially retentive at that age. So, the Romans knew this. Your father had you educated in your letters, your manners, and of course your physique too. The education of the body was an inextricable part of the system, because to the Romans, we were not heads with bodies, we were bodies. The martial dimension of life was just that, a dimension of life. It was not a choice. So you had to be well trained if you wanted to survive. For this reason, the Cursus Honorum began with 10 years of mandatory military service in the ranks of the Roman equites. Some people like to call them knights. I think it's a bit anachronistic, so let's just say it's the Roman cavalry unit. You either joined that, or if you were really valuable, you'd join the retinue of a general who was a relative or a friend of the family. This obviously is where you experienced the blood and guts involved in running an empire. This was the 10-year period of your life which shaped you in a way many politicians today will never be shaped, whether for good or for ill. You endured the cold, the mud, the groaning and moaning, the raping, the plundering, the death of your closest friends, the death of your worst enemies, the enslaving of their women and children, the order-taking, the order-giving, the travel, the candlelight Homer, and, in general, the coming into Roman manhood. This was the lived experience part of a man's education. This is where you acquired your own auctoritas, severitas, gravitas, dignitas, and so forth. Now, in addition to this position, there was a more prestigious position at this rung as military tribune. In the early Roman Republic, these were 24 20-year-old men, 2/3 of whom were elected by the tribal assembly, and the rest by a consul or the senate. And these were reserved as commanders in the legion, with 6 tribunes for each legion. The tribunes could also be appointed on the fly by military commanders when that was needed. Once your 10 years in the military was up, assuming you actually lived, which, let's face it, your odds weren't great, the following steps of the Cursus Honorum were achieved by direct election every year. The first official post was that of quaestor. So, at minimum, candidates had to be 32 years old, but if you were of patrician rank, you could subtract 2 years from this. So, the minimum age for them would be 30. I presume it was just assumed that if you were born into a patrician family, you'd have the connections and the head start other people around you didn't have, allowing you to skip ahead. A more cynical mind, though, might claim that this was a way of stunting the plebeian careers. A more cynical mind, however, might make the claim that this was a way of stunting the plebeians' careers, based on some of those old antique eugenics practices the aristocratic classes subscribed to. At any given time, there were 20 quaestors serving in the financial administration of Rome. Either that or they acted as second in command to the governors of provinces, so you might get relocated somewhere nice, or perhaps somewhere abysmal. It really depends. Quaestors did stuff like serve as HR for the legions, too. You knew how the army worked from the inside out, so now you were expected to administer it. Academia today is sometimes like this. Some of the best teachers become administrators, essentially pushing the best of the best away from teaching and research and into managing people. Quaestors also supervised public games, which were quasi-religious affairs in and of themselves. Once a quaestor, you could wear the toga praetexta. If you got this job, you were expected to become a very important official. Now, at 36, as a former quaestor, you could stand for election as one of the aediles. As an aedilis, you'd have had a number of administrative responsibilities at Rome. You took care of the temples, hence the title, from the Latin aides, temple. You would organize games. You were responsible for the upkeep of public buildings, of water and food supplies. These guys were responsible for overseeing the completion of massive contracts and often bankrolling them as well. So many of these guys went into astronomical debt in their aedilitas in order to earn the gratitude to carry them to the praetorship. It's sort of like that fake it till you make it rich gamble that some people like to do in Hollywood with their credit cards. Now, these debts typically contributed to the corruption of magistrates, who generally sought to extort a small fortune from their provinces to pay off their old debts. In fact, while Cicero paints the ex-governor Verres as a villain throughout his trial, what he attributes to him is quite frank, and that's that, due to the nature of the Roman political game, a man is required to extort thrice as much during his governorship, first to pay himself, then to pay his debts, and then to pay his lawyer. So, we're talking about aediles. The idea was that 2 of these guys would be plebeian and then 2 would be patrician in order to maintain a sort of harmony of the orders. The patrician, aka old money aediles, were called curule aediles, after these special authoritative chairs they sat on. The plebeian, aka new money aediles, were elected by the plebeian council, and the curule aediles were either elected by tribal assembly or appointed by the reigning consul. Magistrates also used the sella curulis, so the curule aedile was a magistrate while the plebeian wasn't. Though part of the Cursus Honorum, this step was optional and was not required in order to hold future offices. Though generally you held this office after the quaestorship and before the praetorship, there were cases where this order was not followed. Now, after occupying the office of either quaestor or aedile, at 39 years old you'd be able to run for praetor. Throughout Roman history, the number of praetors elected varied, and as a general rule of thumb, the number increased with time. During the Republic, which is the period we're focused on now, 6 or 8 were generally elected each year to serve a judicial function throughout Rome and other governmental responsibilities. When the consuls were off to war, you'd be given command of the garrison at Rome. By and large, however, their chief function was largely that of a judge. Anyhow, these praetors decided the outcome of criminal trials and gave orders to set right any crimes with state-sanctioned corrective behaviors. Furthermore, you got 6 lictors to follow you around, and ultimately you had the power of life and death over those around you, aka imperium. Outside of the pomerium, your lictors got their axes. Within the pomerium, they only had the rods. Outside of a martial setting or some extraordinary event, Romans took magistrates executing Roman citizens very fucking seriously. This is one of the reasons Paul of Tarsus made appeals to his citizenship in the face of execution. So this didn't just happen willy-nilly. Now, the next step above praetor was to serve as a provincial governor in the office of propraetor, commanding the province's legions and possessing ultimate authority within their provinces. These were extraordinary wartime positions going into the Second Macedonian War from 200 to 197 BC. They soon after became a standard feature to keep the Republic moving. There were other kinds of praetors too. The praetor peregrinus, he was the chief judge of trials involving one or more foreigners. Peregrinus you might recognize as the root word for pilgrim or traveler. And the praetor urbanus, the urban praetor, was the chief judicial office in Rome. As this guy, you had the power to overturn any verdict by any other courts, and you served as a judge in cases involving criminal charges against provincial governors. For this reason, the praetor urbanus was not allowed to leave the city for more than 10 days. Alright, now, for the final rung on the power ladder, at least the basic Republican ladder, the Office of Consul, which at any given time was filled by 2 individuals. This was the most prestigious of all offices. It represented the apex of a successful career, the outward manifestation of a life lived in civic virtue. The Romans practically ascribed a kind of metaphysical epigenetic mystique to this office, which more or less permeated your family history for generations to come. There were all kind of rituals like the parading of burial masks and offering meals to your ancestors at their tombs, and these kinds of achievements in the political system were tied into the whole tradition of ancestor worship. having been a consul was the highest possible honor. The minimum age was 42 for the plebeians and 40 for the patricians. The office was so important to the Romans that time itself, the calculation of years, were determined according to who was consul that year. So, for instance, what we call 61 BC, the Romans called Marcus Messala et Marcus Pisone consolibus, during the consulship of Messala and Piso. Now, I'm not sure I've mentioned it elsewhere, but the Greeks reckoned their time according to which archons ruled that year. A more sophisticated folk, namely historians, used the Olympic Games for their dating system, the first of which was held in 776 BC, and then performed every 4 years after that. Now, your average Greek commoner would have had their own local calendar, along with an eventual pan-Hellenic standardized system. This is just another way we can see how ancient politics, religion, time, and space were all jumbled up together in one big, inextricable mess. Now, the main role of the consuls was to set the city's political agenda, command large-scale armies, and oversee the governorship of provinces. Consuls held the highest power as judges in the Republic, being the only people with the power to override the decisions made by the Praetor Urbanus. Now, here's the shtick about the consuls. They were only allowed to serve for a single year. Remember, the Romans hated kings. The restrictions were intended to limit the amassing of power. Not only that, but the fact that they were two consuls served as a system of checks and balances, since each consul could veto the other's decisions. The Senate and the People's Assembly, hence the term SPQR, had enacted all sorts of legislations to limit consular powers, and eventually the people pushed for the ability to have a tribune of the plebs. This was a representative of the people, you could say, who could veto any of the consul's decisions. This was great and all, except for the fact that all it did was freeze things up and eventually caused the overly ambitious to find ways of exceeding the rank of consul, like Sulla taking the title of dictator and Augustus taking on imperator. Now, as consul, you'd have taken turns as chairman of the Senate, rotating on a monthly basis with your co-consul. You were the supreme commanders in the Roman army as well, with each consul being granted 2 legions during their year. This would vary, however. This part of being consul is pre-Second Punic War, whereas much of my description of the other stuff is a bit later. As I said, this system was not immutable and monolithic. By the 2nd century, the consuls were assigned to armies, or assigned the responsibility of levying armies, and also given a responsibility either geographic or military. Rome's system was too flexible to be nailed down so easily. Now, as consul, you were escorted by 12 fasces carrying lictors. You maintained the imperium, the power of life and death over most people around you outside the pomerium, and you wore the toga praetexta, dyed with the Phoenician purple we discussed. After your consulship was over, you'd get sent out to rule over one of the more important provinces as a governor with proconsular imperium. This convention was established by the end of the Second Punic War. Proconsuls would also be assigned to complete a war they had begun if the Senate was pleased with their progress and felt that there was no better choice. Though usually the new consul would want to get involved if there was any more battle or booty to be had. You could eventually reapply for consulship, but only after an interval of 10 years to prevent anyone from holding too much power. Obviously, you'd be pretty old by this point, and a 10-year intermission would often see you dead before you got the consulship again. But, some of these guys did live a fairly long time once they got out of the army. Alright, so lastly, after a term as consul, the final step in the Cursus Honorum was being a censor. This office was held for a period of 18 months instead of the usual 12. Censors were elected every 5 years, and it was considered a tremendous honor to be chosen as one. You'd be responsible for taking a regular census of the people, and then allocating the citizens into voting classes on the basis of their income and tribal affiliations. The censors were also in charge of managing the boys' club. They managed the membership roll of the Senate, adding all the new senators who had been elected. So, as a censor, you would also have a couple financial duties as well. They were even in charge of auctioning off or leasing out conquered lands. Alright, so that about does it for what I want to say about Roman education and overall cultural expectations and frameworks. So we've spoken over the last couple lectures about Roman religion and social structures. We've spoken about Phoenician and Carthaginian religion and social structures. And today we've done some extra work by looking at Rome's political framework. All of this is going to be essential in understanding the upcoming lectures in the Punic Wars, the Roman Revolution, and ultimately the transition from republic to empire. We'll be throwing around words like tribune, praetor, consul, dictator, and so forth, and if you don't know what these mean or how they're ranked, nothing's really going to make sense. So what I suggest is you do a quick search for a diagram of Rome's political structure, and then just stare at it for a minute. I'm sure no harm will come of that. Make sure to also brush up on your ancient geography while you're at it. At the very least, all the major cities around the Mediterranean at this time. With that said, I'd like to wish you all a very good day. Thanks for listening. I'm Dan Atrell, and you're listening to the Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History.